What's up, y'all? Welcome to the PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Dustin Jones. I'm one of two lead faculty in the older adult division, along with my partner in crime, Christina Previtt. We teach all the modern management of the older adult courses. That's the online essential foundations, the online advanced concepts, and the live 2-day course. Today, we are going to continue our series looking at balance assessment. We are going beyond the Berg. That's the name of this series, to really see how we can dial in our balance assessment to really see what aspects are contributing to someone's balance deficit, and that will ultimately help inform our interventions. Before we dive into the content, I do want to recognize that today is Wednesday. It means it's Jerry on Ice. It's also Hump Day. You have likely received the Hump Day Hustling email that Jeff Moore sends out at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time every Wednesday with 5 very, very helpful links, whether social media posts or research articles that are going to be helpful for your practice, and just a great read, honestly. But if you're not getting that, I would highly encourage you to do so. ptonice.com, go to the bottom, and you can sign up there. All right, today's content. So just to give you all a very, very quick review of this Beyond the Berg series, if you haven't listened or watched some of those episodes, I encourage you to do that, because we kind of broke down balance into inputs, then the processing piece, and then the outputs that the neuromuscular system provides, which ultimately determines our balance capacity. So these inputs are the visual input, the somatosensory input, and then the vestibular input that comes together. Those signals are processed centrally in many areas of the brain and the brainstem, and then we have that motor output where we are trying to keep our center of mass over our base of support in static and dynamic situations. In the first episode, I talked about how to assess those visual inputs to see if there is a visual deficit that could contribute to impaired balance or increased falls risk. The second episode was looking at the somatosensory and vestibular systems of assessing if there are deficits there. So those were measuring the inputs. Now let's talk about the processing and the outputs. How can we assess that to determine where deficits lie within someone's balance, which is ultimately going to inform our interventions? So if we think about testing balance, I think a lot of us are thinking mostly along the line of outputs. We think of testing strength, for example. We may have someone do a timed up and go and kind of get a very vague balance assessment there, or even do something like the short physical performance battery test, the SPPB, where we a component of that is having people in different static situations of feet together, semi-tandem, tandem stance, and kind of get an idea of people's balance perspective. We may do a Berg, for example, which is pretty prevalent, especially in the home health setting, skilled nursing facilities, things of that nature. Will give you a good idea of people's balance capacity. However, we may only be getting a small a chunk of the pie, if you will. We may not be getting the full picture of someone's balance capacity, because some of those tests are kind of limited in the different aspects of output that we know contribute to someone's balance. So let's talk about some of the things that are not as common in clinical practice, but very, very helpful and will ultimately inform your intervention. So let's first break this down. We're going to talk about processing. So how we process a lot of those inputs to maintain our center of mass over our base of support. So what I want to mention is the clinical test of sensory integration in balance. So this is not a new test. This is something that many of us may be familiar with, where there are typically 6 different conditions where we are taking away or impairing a different system. So we may be standing on a nice firm surface, just a nice relaxed stance, but then taking away vision and seeing how we respond when we are taking away that visual input. We may put someone on a foam surface, for example, where they do have that visual input, and see how they respond. Do they have an impaired balance capacity if they are on that foam surface that's really compensating or harming or impairing the somatosensory system, if you will. However, the standard clinical test of sensory integration and balance, or CAT-SIB, is what you'll hear often. May not be that quick or kind of equipment heavy as well. So clinically, something that's very, very easy to implement and very quick is the modified CAT-SIB. So the modified clinical test of sensory integration in balance. And so what that looks like is you have 4 different stances. All you need is a foam pad, so like a typical AirX foam pad. And so you have people try and hold 30 seconds in 4 different scenarios. So the first one is firm surface, eyes open. and her feet are together. Try and hold it for 30 seconds. All right, then position 2, we're going to take away the eyes. So still a firm surface, taking away the eyes. So eyes closed for 30 seconds. And then position 3 is we're going to put them on that foam surface. So we're impairing that somatosensory input, and then we're going to allow them to have that visual input as well. They're still getting that vestibular input all the time. And so see how they perform. And then position 4 is where they're on the foam. So somatosensory input is impaired, but then they're also closing their eyes. So they're heavily relying on their vestibular input to maintain their balance. And so what you'll see is typically stages 1, stages 2 are okay. I mean, it all depends on the person in front of you and kind of the setting that you're in, honestly. But positions 3 and 4 is when it all falls apart for a lot of people. But that can be very, very helpful to tell you how, which system they are maybe leveraging more. They may be more dependent on, let's say, their visual system, for example, their visual inputs, if they have impairments in the somatosensory system or vestibular, for example. So when you take away the eyes or that visual input, you will see a big deficit in their balance performance. So these different scenarios and how they respond can really dictate or inform how you may want to do your treatments, for example. If someone really struggles on the foam pad in both conditions, and so you're seeing that they are really struggling when they are not getting a good somatosensory input, or they may have some type of medical diagnosis that really limits that, we may want to train them or leverage some of our interventions to where they are on an unsteady surface, where they may be doing some things on carpet or on the pad or on grass or on gravel or on some of these unstable like surfaces. That could be very, very helpful for them. So based on the results of that test, that can give you an idea of what someone may be too dependent on, but also what may be not performing well, which you will already get an idea of that when you've tested those inputs before. So the modified CAT-SIB, great, very quick assessment that can ultimately refer you to what interventions are going to be appropriate. I'm going to talk more about that in the next PT on Ice. But something else that I think is very, very helpful in this regard in terms of looking at that processing piece of integrating a lot of those different inputs that we have to maintain our balance is a way to be able to assess this in a more objective manner. And this is not necessarily what I'm going to recommend or speak to. There's not a lot of normative data for this. However, when I think of building the bike, of being able to demonstrate our value, to demonstrate change, and when we can measure something that is can be very sensitive, if you will, to where we can really show change in a rather short period of time, that's very valuable, for us, but then also our patients buy-in, and us continuing to build that therapeutic alliance to help them out. So what I'm referring to is using a smartphone. I did a PT on Ice episode on this, I think it was a couple of months back, of some of these apps and softwares that you are taking the accelerometer in this lovely smartphone and being able to hold it to your chest, for example, and perform some of these different stances or postures like you see in the modified CAT-SIB, and actually measure postural sway. We used to really have to depend on force plates for that, but now we can use the cell phone to measure how much postural sway that we're seeing in different directions. And so there's things like Sway Medical is one that comes to mind, where you can pay, I think it's per patient, to be able to track some of this data. Now the norms, they're not norms at the moment. However, you can show a pre and post intervention to show some significant change, which is pretty valuable, definitely with building the bike. So something like Sway Medical can be helpful. I will link to that PT on Ice episode where I speak more to that, which will be helpful. So that's more the processing piece. Let's go on to the next one, and that's the reactive or the response strategies. So what happens when someone gets in a situation where they're having to maintain their balance, or an unexpected perturbation, for example? There's a couple things I want to speak to here. The first one is a test that we have spoken to before, and that is the mini BEST test. So that is the mini balance evaluation systems test, mini BEST test. There will be a link in this video description so you all can check that out. But this is a very, very great test. It's very applicable, especially in the outpatient setting, to assess some of these different systems about how people are responding. And they have a great section where they are measuring the reactive and response strategies. So people, you will lean into the patient will lean into the therapist, and anteriorly, and then they'll do one posteriorly, and then one to the side as well laterally, to measure basically their stepping strategy, how they recover from when they are leaning on the therapist, and the therapist steps away, takes that support away, and they're having to perform that stepping strategy to maintain their center of mass over their base of support. And so you can't necessarily measure it in the sense of timing, for example, or how much force they're putting into the floor or anything along those lines. However, you can get a good idea how many steps did they take to maintain their balance, and you can measure that. And actually there's a scoring system with the mini best test that can be very, very helpful. These can be rather fearful for your patients, so I would definitely be aware of that and accommodate for that where you can. Maybe have some handholds that may be within a reasonable distance if people are very afraid, that they know worst case scenario I can always hold on to this. Typically I will have a strap or a gait belt around their waist so they know I've got a handhold if I need to, but then just kind of do a walkthrough to make sure that they're actually going to put a decent amount of their body weight into your hands and will trust you enough to kind of let go, and then they will perform that stepping strategy. So the mini best test, I'm going to link to that will go through that full description of that particular category. If you don't do the full mini best test, which I encourage you to do so, this piece is going to be very, very helpful and informative for you, that is also going to inform your interventions as well. And so with that kind of reactive component, there's a big talk in the Jerry PT world, and especially in the balance world, of that reactive component can be tough to measure. How can we do that? Well, we can with some very special and fancy treadmills that are rather expensive, something like the Active Step, for example, where there are force plates within that treadmill where they will perform trips and slips and be able to measure the time difference between that trip or that slip and your response and the step following. And that is a very, very detailed assessment. You can see that time, that reaction timing, and also show change over time, which is absolutely amazing, but not practical for a lot of folks. So if we have a tough time measuring that reactive component, what about volitional step training, for example, or some of these volitional strategies to maintain your balance? And so a lot of folks are looking at what's the difference between the two. Is there a big difference? And for practicality's sake, can we train that volitional side of things and still improve on that reactive component? And that's where something like the Clock Yourself app comes in. We've talked about Clock Yourself a good bit. Meg Lowry down in Australia is the physio that developed this. We do this in our MMOA Live course in the balance piece, and it is always an amazing experience to see clinicians get introduced to this app. And I want you all to download it yourself, but this is often, we often speak to this in the intervention piece, but I want you to think about it from the assessment piece as well. So the Clock Yourself app, there's you pretend like there's a clock around your feet and there's a verbal cue to step to that particular number, but there are steps per minute, and you can gauge, what people are able to do at that particular speed. And so I found it to be rather helpful to say, this person is able to achieve a full clock face for 60 seconds, for example, with 0 mistakes at 30 steps per minute. And then we retest, and then maybe 4-8 weeks down the road we can get to maybe 50 or 60 steps per minute. The people in outpatient will likely be able to do a little bit more than that, but that's something that we can think about to really assess and measure. Granted, there's not normative values to say, oh, you are 78 and you have a medical history of a stroke and you just did 20 steps per minute, that means you're at a risk for falls. We can't say that per se. There's not normative data. However, for yourself and to be able to build the bike, this could be some valuable information. So that's the processing piece. The modified CAT SIB. We talked about the postural sway technology that we can use. We talked about the response strategies in the mini best test, but then also Clock Yourself as well. And then last but not least, blending in some cognitive demand with some of these balance tasks. The mini best does a great job of this, where they do a dual task timed up and go. So you do a timed up and go, You measure that time, and then you do a dual task timed up and go where you're counting down from 100 by 7. And so you're trying to see what's the difference in time between that first timed up and go and then the dual task timed up and go. If there's more than a 10% difference in their time, that means that their cognition could be impairing their performance, especially in very complex activities and situations. And so we can have interventions to where we're going to practice that. We may blend some cognitive demand in some of our balance activities to really mimic what real life is like, because typically real life is not the clean, sterile environment that a lot of our interventions or tests occur in. So that's something that we can do. Also with Clock Yourself, you can leverage that too. Whenever you get to, I think it's the gold level or bronze, I cannot remember, but the particular level, you can adjust whether it's numbers or whether it's months that Meg is calling out. And that can be a great assessment to see how people are able to do that, at what speed, and then be able to show change down the road. So those are some things I want you all to think about. Continue to do your traditional balance assessment, the ones that were definitely very familiar to us, but really think about teasing out those inputs. Check their visual system, check their somatosensory systems, check their vestibular system to see how are those inputs actually functioning, and then also test the processing and the output piece. Test their modified CAT-SIB to see how those different inputs are processing in those outputs that they're able to produce. How do they do in those different environments? Postural sway is another great thing that we can do, even with the help of a nice cell phone app like Sway Medical, for example. And I should say, I have no connections with Sway whatsoever. They just seem to be pretty dialed in terms of what they're trying to create and how that could be helpful for people like us, the Jerry PTs. If you will. But then also test the response strategies. Mini Best Test does a great job of this. We can test their reactive strategies with the Mini Best, but then also something like an active step treadmill. But if you don't have that kind of money or that kind of space, you can do volitional stepping, like Clock Yourself, and be able to get some type of measurement there. And then last but not least, throwing in that cognitive demand with some of these activities to see how they respond to a more complex environment. You take all of that together and you will be able to provide a solid plan of care to be able to influence someone's balance capacity. And we're going to talk about that next and to wrap up the Beyond the Berg series. All right, so that's enough. Gone about 16, 17 minutes now. Want to mention Modern Management of the Older Adult, Essential Foundations. So that's our 8-week introductory course. We're halfway through our cohort right now, and our next cohort is going to be starting March 18th. If you want to learn how to scale and modify and actually apply some of these functional movements that we talk about on this podcast, the squat, the deadlift, the loaded carry, burpees, or floor transfers, sign up for that class. We talk a lot about clinical geriatric syndromes, about exercise prescription, about psychosocial considerations. What does a good Jerry PT assessment look like? Sign up for that class. And then if you've already taken Essential Foundations, the first cohort of Modern Management of the Older Adult Advanced Concepts launches March 11th. That's where we take a deep dive into some of these specific conditions that are complicated, however very common in the world of Jerry PT, and how to apply some of these principles to where we can be the providers of choice for folks regardless of their medical diagnosis. You have to have taken Essential Foundations to get into Advanced Concepts. So check those out. Links will be in the description as well as the comments. If y'all have any questions or any comments, hit me up. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this episode. Otherwise, I will talk to y'all in a couple weeks.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.